This is Decentralized Radio. I'm Tristan.
And I'm Ryan.
The goal of this podcast is to help educate you on how to live your most optimal life. We will host industry expert guests to shed light on topics that matter.
We are not gurus, rather two individuals who have had to pave their own path to health and vitality, independent of the centralized systems that plague modern society. Today, we're talking to critically acclaimed strength coach Moritz. Through his training, he has produced 3 Olympic gold medal winners as well as 7 professional world champions. And in this episode, we're going to be focusing on everything nutrition and strength optimization for your health. So let's dive in.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Decentralized Radio. Today, we have an exciting podcast guest. We have Moritz Klatten from Germany, who is definitely aligned with a lot of the things we're into today. So welcome, Moritz. How's it going?
Nice to meet you. I'm doing really well. How about you?
Good. And our lovely co-host as well, Ryan. How's it going?
Thanks, man. It's doing good. Just spent all day in the sun, back inside. Feel like I got to get outside right after this because the blue light's just drying out my eyes, but we're banging. I'm ready for this.
Awesome. So Moritz, a mutual friend, Leon, put me on to you and, is checking out your profile, what you're into. It's right up our alley, Bitcoin, meat, cold exposure, breath work, boxing, strength training. It's really like what I'm all about too. So why don't we, dive in a little bit of your background and starting maybe on, the health fitness side of things, like, what kind of got you into this space? Was it boxing? How did you recently become more, training people in cold and breath work? Yeah. So if you could just provide a background, how you kind of got into a lot of these cool modalities.
Sure. I'm into strength and conditioning since like 2000. And my main mentor was Charles Poliquin. He's one of the most influential persons in my life, not just when it comes to strength training, also to diet and also a lot of other things. And I've been specializing in strength and conditioning mainly for professional athletes, not just training boxers, also training football players. That's like the number one sport here in Europe. And so that I started first in strength and conditioning, basically specializing in training athletes. And then I really got also into boxing, and not just training boxers, not just doing the strength and conditioning, but also doing the boxing training. And I've also been managing a lot of fighters. So I've been training like over 5 world champions. And recently in the last few years, since 4 years, I'm also teaching people when it comes to cold exposure and breath work. So when it comes to breath work, my main mentor is basically Wim Hof. He's also a good friend of mine, and I've learned a lot from him, basically. And also thanks to Leon for hooking this up. He's the guy basically that orange pilled me. So I'm very thankful to him for that.
There we go. Yeah, we need to get him on here as well. So, that's really cool. I'm curious, what modalities, are you like implementing with, your clients? You talk about football players. I played football, soccer here in the US, my whole life, and college as well. So how are you kind of taking a modern approach? Because I'm curious how it is on the professional side of things. A lot of the professional athletes here in the US, some of them, are very into their health and training, doing like hyperbaric oxygen and cold and have a very clean diet. But then a lot of them are still like eating junk and, playing video games all day. And I'm curious, how you see it at a high level. I know a lot of the elite soccer, football teams are very biometric heavy. They wear a lot of these bibs and tracking recovery and a lot of these things. But yeah, I'm curious how you implement, maybe cold breath work and diet into their protocol, because obviously they're a lot more, glycolytic than the average person as well.
Well, I would say that when it comes to strength and conditioning, you are actually way more advanced in the US than in Europe. And especially the football players, most of them never really reach their full potential because they don't really take that well care of their diet. There's few exceptions, but most of them don't. And most of them, they don't even train twice per day. So, and it's absolutely the wrong training, So I guess when I look at American football, for example, I think the strength and conditioning is already much more advanced at a much higher level. So if I compare sports, In boxing, it's different. Most of the fighters do reach their full potential, but it's also different going into a fight than going into a game, So when I meet fighters, often I have to actually make sure that they actually train less. They're actually in overtraining. Whereas with football players, that hardly ever happens. Most of them are undertrained,
So I'm sort of curious because I know you're into sort of animal-based diets as well. I'd love to know sort of your experience with yourself and your own training and stuff like that with animal-based diets, and sort of why you've leaned to sort of that side of the spectrum versus like a stereotypical or athletic. I know here in the US, it's like a lot of carbohydrates and stuff like that is predominantly what's spoken about in the world of sports. And I'm not like the most athletic dude. I'm kind of a rail over here, but I guess it's just very interesting to me because it sounds counterintuitive. And I know we're all into it, but I think it'd be good for the listener to sort of hear your point of view on that.
No, absolutely. Like through my mentor, Charles Poliquin, I incorporated eating a lot of meat, like very early on, like in 2002, I was already eating, like he taught me to eat a meat and nuts breakfast. So you basically eat one type of meat, whether that's like bison, buffalo, or beef. And you add like a few nuts, maybe an avocado or something. And it's really the perfect breakfast to get your day started. You raise your dopamine, which is like the neurotransmitter of motivation. You raise your acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter of attention. So that's the best way to start the day, So I kept doing that for 20 years now. And I find it not just the most best diet for fighters or athletes, it's even for executives, So it's also absolutely the right thing to stay sharp during the day, I would not call myself, like many plebs call themselves carnivores. I wouldn't call my diet. I'm not a carnivore. Like if I eat just meat, for me it's like a bit of a taste fatigue, because obviously just with meat, to cover all the nutrients, you need to eat so many organs. I mean, I do like calf's liver and calf's brain, but I don't like to eat that on a daily basis myself. And if I just eat meat, it's a bit too acidic for my type of diet. So I like to eat. I sometimes tell people it's like I'm on a vegetarian diet. The only thing I do is that I add 2 kilograms of meat, so.
No, I think that's a good point too. And I don't consider myself carnivore either. I mean, in the winter, I'm probably more carnivore-ish, but still eating, fermented vegetables, sauerkraut, things like that. But yeah, it's interesting. So I'm curious as well, you talked about the overtraining, undertraining aspect. I think this is something that's really been talked a lot about in the health community. It's like, rest is extremely important. A lot of people overdo it, especially when it comes to hormonal health. Like testosterone can definitely, plummet when you're overtraining, especially chronic cardio. So I'm curious, how are you kind of measuring these things in your, athletes that you're working with? You're saying football players, a lot of them are not really training to their full potential. So how are you kind of monitoring this balance, and how does that relate to maybe, the everyday amateur athlete or, weekend warrior, kind of someone like me who's, training quite a bit, but of course not at the, professional level?
Well, for me, the tools, I like to keep it simple, I think genius is, as Albert Einstein said, genius is in simplicity, So I don't want to have also the amateur athletes, they don't have all these measurement tools available. So what I use is basically I measure the vertical jump on a daily basis and I measure the weight. And those things, especially also lean athletes, sometimes overnight they lose a kilogram or something for no reason, even though they had a big meal. So that's sometimes a sign of overtraining. And once you lower your vertical jump, the measurement, that's also a good sign of overtraining. So those are the 2 tools. And then I also look at the training week and what they've done, So I don't have full control of all the training other than the strength and conditioning with the athletes, other than the boxers that I train. So often also when I look what they've done, and they have done way too much aerobic work. So I personally think that aerobic work is really overrated for most sports, especially like for football and soccer and boxing. These are not aerobic sports. And I think that aerobic training is like self-castrating human nature, So we don't kill an animal by throwing a rock. We don't chase after the rabbit for 3 hours. All we do is we do a short sprint, throw a rock at the rabbit, and that's how we kill the rabbit, So that's natural to me. So if you look at the hormonal response after aerobic training, it's pretty terrible, So your growth hormone goes down, your testosterone goes down, cortisol goes up. And if you do, let's say, sprint training, it's exactly the opposite, The testosterone goes up, growth hormone goes up, cortisol actually goes down.
So that's even prevalent in, the aerobic sports of boxing and soccer/football. Is what you're saying. You're still focused on, more, explosive sprint level distances as opposed to kind of longer cardio sessions?
Absolutely, because all of these sports are actually anaerobic sports. So whether it's boxing also, if you look at football, the money in football is earned by the people that are the quickest in the first 2-4 meters.
Yeah.
It's not like running a marathon or something,
Yeah, I think there's more stop and go than people realize. Playing, soccer my whole life, it's a lot of slow trotting around and then, some explosive sprinting. And, you have to have a good aerobic base, I think, but I think you can easily overtrain that. And I feel like you build a good aerobic base by just playing the sport. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense maybe to overdo it outside of that. So, and you're taking their weight, every night and then in the morning, or what frequency are you doing that?
Right. I like to measure the weight right in the morning after they wake up, and the vertical jump as early as possible whenever they can do it. If they don't have a way to measure it at home, then at the club,
Understood. And in terms of another thing, in general is muscle mass. I feel like, boxing, football, American football is a bit different. The muscle mass of most NFL players is pretty substantial. But, in soccer and European football and boxing, I feel like there's kind of a happy medium between, how bulky and muscular you are and, how quick you can be. So is that something you kind of take into account, training wise as well, and trying to reach a sweet spot with people for both muscle mass as well as, body fat percentage? Or do you kind of just, that's a byproduct of the training you have?
I think that it's still like people think that most of them are not really bulky enough. So with most of these athletes, you can actually add quite a lot of muscle mass, and they believe that it does waste energy and it slows them down. But if it's gained in the right rep ranges, let's say, for example, for soccer and football, you're training in the low rep ranges and you just focus on strength training, getting their strength up, then it's not wasting any energy. It's actually making them more explosive, So if you look at sprinters, for example, they do really heavy squats sometimes on the day of the competition, So the same would really work also for sports like boxing and football as well.
That is interesting. You mentioned hormonal dysregulation from too much aerobic exercise. Because in my own experience, and I'm not an athlete, I played golf in college, which isn't really an aerobic or a strength sport. I guess you could argue the strength side is actually more important now, especially with professional golfers actually beefing up. It's kind of interesting. But what I found fascinating is that in my own experience, training is that at my worst health several years ago, I was doing a lot of cardio and my testosterone was tanked, completely tanked. And I do know that strength training is important for testosterone and stuff like that, and sleep and all that stuff. But I think it's just sort of a misnomer with aerobic exercise in general that it's the most beneficial exercise. I have conversations with a lot of friends about this that consider running to be the best exercise for weight loss, for example. And I don't necessarily think that to be the case. I don't think that's what you would find either, Moritz, right?
Absolutely, because of the hormonal response from it, So that's why most doctors, they would still prescribe aerobic work also for health. And one of the most important things for determining the age of your life is actually muscle mass and also strength, So there's also really new studies confirming that, but it obviously takes time until doctors actually read into this and actually apply this, So you do have some good functional nutritionists and doctors in the States, but in Germany, in my country, that's really lacking still,
Yeah, I feel like there's not as many gym bros in Germany, maybe in Europe in general. It's gotten better. I visit Europe quite a bit.
It's getting better for sure.
There's more gyms, but yeah, the average person is definitely more prevalent in the US, which is interesting. I don't know if it's a good thing as well, but then you get the whole, gym bro culture, and, half the people are on steroids. So it's, that's a whole nother issue. But the next thing I want to talk about is something that I'm very passionate about, something that has really gotten mainstream the past 6 months. And I think that's because of Andrew Huberman, Joe Rogan, and that's cold exposure, cold therapy. And I'm curious on a few things is, how you incorporate this into your athletes programs. I know recently, everyone's talked about, pre-workout or, in the beginning of the day is more ideal compared to post-workout. So you don't blunt like hypertrophy, natural inflammatory responses. I'm curious as well, you talk about Wim Hof training and, how you incorporate, breath work into the practice. But yeah, what do you do with cold? How do you reap the benefits of it without overdoing it? And, how are you doing it in terms of a timing protocol and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to really be careful when you incorporate this type of training. If it's new to an athlete, it can also put a lot of stress on the adrenals. So you need to get the athletes slowly used to it and also do the right timing. As you said, like, for example, if you want after a hypertrophy session, if that's the response that you want, then it actually blunts that because you create inflammation and the cold exposure decreases inflammation. So it's absolutely the wrong thing to do right after strength training and hypertrophy session. But for those people, you could incorporate it before the session even, or like in the morning, like a few hours before the session. But after, let's say, a running session or a specific sports session, that's whether that be boxing or football, they can actually do it right after, and it actually gives you a good response because then it's actually good to reduce inflammation right after the session.
So it's like an ice bath after practice is good then still?
It's great for recovery, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Because my whole life we did, 10, 15 minutes in the ice bath after, intense soccer games or practices. And now with everything going on, this new research, I question whether that was still a good thing. Because now, my training style is different. I just, more strength training. So I do it before I work out. But if you're saying that was still helpful for recovery, then that's good.
After the workout, then you should. If it's like strength and hypertrophy, you should not do it after. But if it's like a specific sports session, then I think it's absolutely fine to do it after.
Okay.
And then the question is also when you did 10, 15 minutes, what type of ice bath that was? Whether it was just really ice cold water. I mean, in Celsius, was it really below 10 Celsius and you stayed 15 minutes in there? Or was it just slightly cold, like between 10, 15 Celsius?
Yeah, it was probably between 10 and 15 Celsius. It wasn't, maybe 10. It was probably right at 10. It's not as cold as I do them at like 1 to 4 C in the winter time. So it's a big difference.
Exactly. And I think then you should not do it 10, 15 minutes. It's way too long.
Now I do like 2.
People tend to really overdo it. You get the full effect after 2 minutes. That's when cold thermogenesis starts taking place. And then you get the full effect. So I personally never prescribe longer than 5 minutes, especially if you do it on a regular basis. Otherwise, it's not actually good for you. Then it actually impairs recovery.
Yeah, that's something Ryan and I were talking about before the show is like, I feel like cold. Yeah. And you said it as well. It's so powerful, but it's so easy to overdo it. So, I've actually, I think 2 or 3 of the times I've gotten sick in the past, like 2-3 years, which has been just about 2 or 3 times, has been from overdoing cold exposure, or, I was just like overdoing too many things. And then I just kind of jumped back in, hadn't done cold in a while, hadn't done it in a few months. And then I was in like, 2C water for like 5 minutes. And yeah, it's easy to overdo it. So really build yourself up.
Naturally, you want to try more. Naturally, we overdo things,
The
so
brain.
It's all about the right dosage. I mean, even water can be toxic if you drink too much of it, So
yeah, it's like the story of my life, overdoing things. But actually, that actually raises a question because you mentioned like being careful, especially when introducing cold therapy to a new athlete. And I sort of would wonder because I've done some cold therapy, but my body's extra sensitive due to some of my autoimmune conditions that I've dealt with in the past and nervous system conditions. So I've gotten to the point where like I do wrist and face dunks, or I just try to do prolonged cold in the natural cold, which is like just natural temperature outside in the winter. But I was curious, how would you ease an athlete in so that they don't have the repercussions that, say, me and Tristan have felt doing it ourselves?
Well, I normally start just with cold showers, slowly start with like 20 seconds, and then increase it to 2 minutes, and then the body gets used to it. And then first, when they do their first ice bath, only really just dip fully in there 10 seconds and then go out. Then either whatever you have available, whether it's a infrared sauna, a Finnish sauna, or a hot shower, you take a hot shower and then you go in there again. But the most important thing is that you always finish with the cold, because then you activate the brown adipose tissue activation right at the end. That's what Huberman calls the Solberg effect,
Yeah. I've heard him talk about it. The other thing actually I was going to ask you was sort of the opposite of that, because I have an infrared sauna sitting over here. When would that be beneficial around like a training time? Because I've done it after.
The best way to do it is you start with the ice, then you go in the sauna, then you go on the ice, then you go in the sauna, and then you finish with the ice, basically.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But sometimes that's also too much. Sometimes it's good enough just to have one ice bath, and that's it. Sometimes it depends also on the day and on the training volume of the week when it comes to athletes.
For sure. There's a lot of nuance in there. And I know, like, for myself, I've had to go low and slow with both, because I've actually overdone it in here and severely dehydrated myself. And I've done that, like you mentioned earlier, like overdoing water. I've done that too, especially going into a more animal-based ketogenic style diet for a while. Flushing all my electrolytes out with too much water it's super dangerous. And you think it's difficult to get low sodium in blood, but it's not when you just drink a lot of plain water without refilling electrolytes and just pissing it away.
Absolutely. I totally agree. That's why I always add electrolytes. Well, what I personally do is just drinking coconut water, that has already all the electrolytes inside, and I find it more natural than adding electrolytes all the time. So it's good to mix it up, actually. Sometimes to drink water and add electrolytes, and sometimes just drinking coconut water, and also what you have available,
So do you combine, breath work with the cold as well, or do you do that kind of separately in, your practices and trainings, or, what do you do on the breath work? I like to really
incorporate it also, but it also really depends on the athletes or on the client. I mean, also sometimes train executives, and then I really like to combine it. And it also depends how spiritual the people are, So if I have more spiritual clients, we do humming in the water. We do actually breath work while you're in the water as well, And then with some guys, we try to separate the whole thing,
So you're saying it's mostly the Wim Hof style of breath, or do you do any other styles? And can you maybe walk us through walk us through like a typical breathwork session, like time? And, I feel like breathwork is, I've experimented, I've read Wim Hof's books. I've, done some, sessions myself every day for months. And I feel like a lot of people still hear this, breath work, and they don't really conceptualize or grasp exactly what it is and how they can implement it into their practice. So I'm curious, what like an average session looks like for you or someone you're training.
So I use the Wim Hof method, but I also rely on a lot of different methods. The Wim Hof method is great. I mean, you take around 30 breaths, and then you do a breath hold with the empty air. You empty the air out, and then one breath hold with full air. And that's also really good. But it really depends on the athlete as well. I don't believe it's so good to hyperventilate if you have anxiety. I personally believe also it's very good also to focus on slow breathing. So I do different variations of the Wim Hof method. So I mix it up. I'm also certified in Soma breath work. And I also produce my own music to do breath work. So you breathe along to the rhythm of the music. So that's a lot more fun, and it's good to vary it, So if you look at the textbooks and the science of breathing, they would actually tell you should not breathe through your mouth, you should breathe through your nose, So the nose has many, many functions. It doesn't just, it filters the air, it moistens the air, it puts the right pressure in the air. So normally we should really breathe through our nose, and especially also at night. That's why also I teach people, if they have sleep apnea and all these kind of things, I really teach them to breathe through their nose at night. And if they can't, also I do mouth taping. So you tape actually your mouth, So it's basically some of the sessions it's similar to the Wim Hof method. It's just the tempo of the breath. So sometimes you inhale, let's say for 4 seconds and exhale for 8 seconds. So it's a really slow type of breath, activating the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's very good for recovery. I don't believe doing the Wim Hof method, hyperventilating at night before going to bed. For me personally, like I can't sleep. I mean, there's some people that can sleep after, but that really impairs my sleep. So at night, I like to do slow breathing. And in the morning, I like to do quicker breathing to energize myself,
That actually makes a lot of sense because I've done some like Tristan. I've read Wim Hof's book and I've actually used his app like quite a bit over the last couple of years. But what I found was doing that sort of hyperventilation breathing for me, and it was interesting that you brought up anxiety. Made me feel anxious, and so for me, I especially like during the time of the day has mattered a lot for me. And I found sort of the same type of practice of doing more of that type of breath work in the morning has a more beneficial effect than later in the day when you're trying to wind it down and kind of bring that sympathetic up or parasympathetic up and go into the evening. I found things like box breathing. Is there anything to like single nostril breathing? Because I've read some stuff about that too.
Oh, I don't particularly use it a lot, but it's also a really effective method, I mean, there's in my eyes, there's not just one method. It's the same thing with a diet. There's not the perfect diet for everybody. And it's the same thing with breathing. So I do use that, but not much. But I also use box breathing. I use Tomo, but like the Wim Hof method is actually based on Tomo. So I like to play around with it, and it's good to really mix it up. So otherwise your body gets used to the same response if you do the same thing over and over again.
So in a sense, it's sort of like hypertrophy training. So you keep mixing it up.
Absolutely. It's exactly the same thing, really. Yeah.
Interesting.
Do you do any, elevation altitude training for some of your athletes? I feel like this is a really hot topic, at least in the fight community and UFC. I know a lot of folks are sleeping in these beds or whatever with high altitude simulation, and then they train at sea level or wherever to get more output from, red blood cells. We both live at kind of higher elevation. We're we're at 1,500 meters here and, hiking up at 3,000 meters pretty regularly. So I'm curious if this is something that, you know about or you implement or you have thoughts on in general, because it's always just like something I'm very interested in and getting people's feedback on.
Well, I personally, for explosive sports, I don't believe in high altitude training because there's studies basically confirming that your type 2B fibers take on properties as type 2A fibers. So this can actually slow you down. And often when you do high altitude training and you go back to normal level, it goes all to normalized and you don't have actually more red blood cells, But if you live at a high altitude, I mean, it certainly does give you a benefit for sure.
Okay. Yeah,
and it also depends on the sport. When it comes to aerobic sports, I would implement actually high altitude training, but not when it comes to explosive sports.
Yeah. I'm just curious. I know whenever I go like just down to sea level for at least just like a few days and I go to the gym, like I feel stronger for sure, but I'm sure like the effects kind of wane. And that's also because I live up here for multiple years and I'm always even higher altitude. But yeah, I'm just always curious if, these fighters in UFC and everyone's just getting these very expensive, fancy tents, and if they actually do anything or if it's just kind of a simulation, placebo effect.
Well, I've been taking part in high altitude training with fighters where we went in the mountains, and if you do it, I would not recommend it for explosive sports, as I said. Then I would recommend actually doing the training camp in mountains rather than using these chambers and everything. You can waste a lot of money on those kind of things. It's the same thing also. Like I think like an ice bath is way more effective than going into a cryotherapy chamber. So I think you can also waste a lot of money on that. And I think a lot of these tools are really expensive and nowhere near as effective. And I think also like an ice bath in nature is also way more effective than an ice bath just at home, So the best way to do it is really in nature, So and I think that's also a problem for a lot of athletes is that they lose completely the connection to nature, And that's also that causes also anxiety in a lot of people because they lose that kind of connection. So if you make those people just at least on the weekends, try to connect with nature. That has like a tremendous effect also on a hormonal response, so.
Yeah, Tristan and I were actually talking also before you came in about my plans like for the summer about getting out like every weekend and camping, or like at least getting in there and hiking and getting out and completely away from everything, because I think we live in these boxes, and I think it actually is detrimental on multiple levels, not just psychologically, but I think innately it's just not where we're meant to be. And so it creates sort of like these psychological tears in our being, and like subconsciously brings everything down for pretty much everyone. So it's kind of fascinating how even we were talking, I think in our last podcast with another guest, about how even escaping for a brief period of time and going into like a pretty desolate area for even a week, like camping, can like completely reset like your circadian rhythms and all that stuff.
Oh, I totally agree. You have people that have insomnia. They go to clinics and spend thousands of dollars. If you take these people just camping like for 2 weeks, it can actually heal insomnia within 2 weeks, So I totally agree. I mean, it really improves resets your circadian rhythm completely.
Is there anything you do for yourself to like help with that? How do you get out and about?
I'm in nature every weekend. Like I swim in the ocean. Like in Germany, I have a house north of Germany on an island called Sylt, and I basically like today I was also swimming in the ocean, and I went to sauna afterwards and everything.
Nice.
So I do that every weekend, and it's almost addictive habit, really. So I really need it. I get depressed. I live in the city, but I get kind of depressed if I stay in the city on the weekends. So for me, I really need to connect with nature on the weekends.
That's pretty cold water too, right? In the
oh yeah, it's really cold, and it feels even like the salt content is especially high here, and the water feels even much colder than the water in the mountains. Actually,
do you wear a wetsuit then when you swim, or is it just brief? Like you're just doing short sprint swimming?
Yeah, well, I don't stay in there that long. I stay in there 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And obviously no wetsuit or anything, just the trunks, and then I just swim around a little bit, and that's it, And it's quite aggressive, especially when you have high waves, But it's a lot of fun, So nature is really brutal.
Yeah, no, and that's awesome. And people like to, most people would say, live in northern Germany or something like that. It's like tough in the winter or whatever. It's like if you want to go outside, like you can go outside in nature. And if you get acclimated to the cold, this is why you do cold training, right? So then in the winter, you're better off, and you can, withstand these colder temperatures without being absolutely miserable. So I think people need to realize that it does matter, and it actually helps you in multiple facets. So before we move on, I just want to ask one last question on the training aspect. Is there anything like you're really excited about that is kind of like coming to the frontier? Like a lot of these modalities talk about have been around for a while. They're free or low cost, but they're extremely effective. Is there anything, new that you think is going to be a difference maker, or do you really stick to these traditional methods, the foundational knowledge of cold, clean diet, sleep, nature, breath work that we talked about?
Yeah, to be honest, I think there's nothing new that really amazes me. It's rather sticking to all these old things, And if you think about also like breath work, I mean, whether it's a Wim Hof method, whether it's box breathing, it's all based on pranayama, So it's nothing new really. So I think we need to rather follow these old traditions and listen to the wisdom of these people back then, So it's amazing how far ahead they were already back a few thousand years ago,
Yeah, I mean, and going back to nature even, it's like a lot of the answers that we look for and things are already out there as far as like looking for the right diet and all this stuff. Like if you just look at nature around you, usually the answers are clear if you remove all the noise. But what really makes it difficult is we're surrounded by all this buzz. And I think that kind of fogs our view.
So we talk a lot about training, breath work. I think it's all fantastic. It's all, very decentralized in nature, right? Like it's free or low cost. These modalities have been around for a long time. They're proven and they're effective. And, you don't need to spend all this money and get roped into the marketing, plies of health. But I'm curious on kind of the opposite side of things now is, you're into Bitcoin. So I want to hear about, how you got to that realization, how you maybe connect the same disciplines or mindset to, your training, and then how you kind of see it as, a valuable asset or, money, resource, everything in today's context.
Well, we were just talking about nature. So I think like Bitcoin is nature. So you should not try to fight it. You should rather embrace it, And so I got into Bitcoin in 2020. I mean, as I said, Leon is the guy, thanks to him. He's the one that orange pilled me. And it was great to have guidance by him. So I didn't even get into shit coins in the first place. So
lucky you, yeah.
So I didn't have to buy any Solana or any Ripple or any shit like that. And so I had this aha moment basically in 2020, during the COVID crisis. I thought, like, if there's a time to invest in this asset, now is the time. So I started buying at $10,000 and then slowly and surely got more into it. But it didn't take me long. It took me only like half a year. And then I almost went like all in basically. So, and it's really good. Like, I mean, it takes some time until you're fully convinced. In the beginning, it was for me like how you perhaps call it NGU, like a number go up technology, So at the beginning, I was only interested in the people that were talking about trading it and concentrating on the number go up technology. And I was actually almost making fun, because I didn't understand it, fun of the people for that used it as like rather FGU, like a freedom go up technology, So, but the more I got into it, now I actually spend more time actually for Bitcoin as a freedom go up technology, So now I'm actually spending more time looking at people like Robert Breedlove, GG, and those kind of guys actually inspire me the most. So I think at the end, the number, it's secondary now to me, So I think this is like a paradigm shift. Like, this is like the time for us to opt into a better system, So, and even the people that get into this just because of personal greed, I mean, Bitcoin, I think turns, as Gigi said, just says, it turns personal greed into freedom, So, I spend most of my time thinking about Bitcoin of my free time. So I spend probably more time thinking about it than not thinking about it,
Yeah, it's actually funny because my friend Eric told me about Bitcoin, I think in 2018, and he kept telling me to get into it. And I just like, I didn't really look into it for myself. I was like, oh man, this is some out there shit. And I was like, I don't know if I can just throw my money in there. And like, what if everyone's telling me about the volatility, and even my dad still like gets on me. He's like, oh man, what about the volatility? I'm like, well, if you think about it, like, how's the volatility been in everything else lately? So what do you think? But I wanted to ask.
That's also like a thing, like, I mean, as Michael Saylor says, volatility is vitality,
Oh yeah, 100%.
It's the same thing when it comes to sport, Let's say if you look at Usain Bolt, he might not be active anymore, but when he was active, his career was very volatile, so he would perform and break a world record and do really well, but then he was injured and he would not perform at all. So with him, you could also say that he was very volatile, but then he could really perform well at the end. And the volatility in Bitcoin is to the upside, so it's not a big problem anyway,
Well, I mean, a lot of it too comes from a lot of, I think, misunderstanding, and I mean, a lot of people that will criticize it often don't know anything about it. And I won't pretend to know like the ins and outs of everything with Bitcoin or any of that. Actually, Tristan's educated me a lot with his book about it. But I actually was curious, how is Bitcoin perceived in Germany over there compared to over here in the US? I tend to meet a lot of people that are into it, but I think that's just because of the space I'm in. But I was kind of curious how it's perceived over there.
Well, it's getting better, but I mean, the mainstream media still don't get it, and I think it's the same thing in the US, So you really need to go really deep down the rabbit hole to really fully understand these things, and especially also understanding proof of work. I mean, you read all these news saying that Bitcoin is so bad for the environment, but I think that's really bullshit. I mean, it's the best way of energy rebalancing, and it's actually good for the environment. And if you invest in Bitcoin, you actually improve the world. You make this world a better place, So it enforces human rights. and people don't understand all these benefits, and I think you can only understand these benefits if you really go deep down the rabbit hole. So, and most of these people never take that time.
Yeah, I mean, at the cusp of it, it's just we're so ingrained in the centralized system that's built around incentives that's serving these big corporations. So the media is owned by big corporations and the government. So the average person is really not going to believe any of this when they're just consuming this falsified extremely biased information of news and everything. So it really does take a personal awakening to kind of go and look at the world through this lens. I know that happened to me, 5-6 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, I should say. And from now, once you have that perspective, you'll never go back. So I think COVID woke up a lot of people, which is good. I think we have a lot more work to do. So it's encouraging to hear, because to be honest, Germany is interesting to me because you guys are like the biggest rule followers in the world almost. And COVID was pretty strict over there. I remember I was there, last spring, and people were still wearing masks like everywhere. I'm just like, wow, this is a whole new world. But, the culture is great. You have a lot of intelligent people. So hopefully, that kind of momentum builds there. It's kind of a decentralized node, and we continue to move upwards here, I think, as well.
Well, Germany is one of the countries that's running actually the most nodes worldwide, if you look at the number of nodes. So
that's good. I think with the energy crisis as well, and maybe you could chime in of that. Maybe a lot of people have begun to question, the mainstream narrative over there also. I believe it's probably likely, right?
It's likely, but there's still so many misconceptions about especially proof of work, I mean, you have even Greenpeace, like, doing campaigns like financed by Ripple, saying how bad it is and everything, but they don't really understand proof of work in more detail, So, and I think that's going to take quite some time, I think, until people actually get that. I think you're way more advanced in the US. I think if you look at some of the senators in Austin and stuff like that.
Do you try and orange pill your athletes at all, or how do you see kind of their perspective in terms of this?
I don't actually. I try not to orange pill my athletes because I try to stay away because of the volatility, and sometimes they're not really. If Bitcoin goes down, then they would already get angry at me and probably lose my client, If you know that you keep the client for 4 years for sure, then I would orange pill them, but I'm actually quite careful about it. But other than that, I'm trying to pretty much orange pill everybody out of my friends and everything. I think the most difficult people to orange pill are actually your own family members, actually, So
I would actually totally agree. Just thinking of my dad and this proof of work thing that you were talking about right before, like people, they misunderstand. I'm going to send this to him when we release this. So could you explain maybe what you see as the biggest misconceptions with proof of work concepts in Bitcoin?
Well, I think the biggest misconception is that it wastes way too much energy, And if you don't see any value in Bitcoin, then it is a big waste of energy, But if this can replace the whole financial system and can really improve this world, then it's totally worth it. And it's the same thing if you look at YouTube. It uses up almost 2% of all the electricity worldwide. If you don't see any value in it, there's a lot of waste of energy. But if you see that you get free education on there and all the good things about it, then it's totally worth it, And I mean, also, if you look at all these high data centers, they use up a lot of energy, but because we see value in them, nobody actually criticizes that,
It's actually a really good way to look at it, because it's all perception. And as long as your perception is looked at as value, then it is meaningful. Because I could argue so many things for the way we, like, our current centralized systems work. All the centralized systems, whether it's medical or like agricultural stuff or anything like that, and all that, you could look at that as lots of waste of energy as well, especially in the agricultural sector, which is a bit of a different topic. But transportation, all these things, it's just perception, like you were saying.
Absolutely. And I think people also put like Bitcoin is in the same bucket as all the other crypto shitcoins, and you really got to differentiate. I mean, Bitcoin was designed to enrich humanity, and all these other shit coins were designed to enrich certain individuals, like in our legacy system, So I think that's a huge difference.
Yeah, I think it's just going to take time. I mean, it's really interesting. To me, it's like fascinating to, see how all this is going to play out. I mean, we've already seen here, a little mini run on bank insolvency. Bitcoin's doing well right now. The price is kind of irrelevant, as you're saying. To me, I almost hope the price stays low. Of course, you realize it's just an accumulation game. But at the end of the day, people are either going to take the dive head first, and with everything, right? Like, you're training professional athletes. You're in a world where it's like you're fully committing to something. You're taking a risk. You're taking a leap of faith. You're betting on yourself, and I feel like you're taking that individual responsibility, and that's what you need to do with Bitcoin as well. I mean, the whole issue, the reason why we started this podcast is because people just keep outsourcing everything of their lives. And then they play this victim mentality, wondering why their lives suck. When in reality, if you rope all that back in, be the sovereign individual, be in control, then you're the one who is at the helms of your own life. And you get to dictate your money, your health, and your, happiness.
No, absolutely. And I mean, especially once they're going to roll out these CBDCs, I mean, then the shit is going to hit the fan, Then like they're already talking about it in Germany, that you won't be able to spend more than 1,000 euros in cash. And then you have a loss of privacy, like, completely. Then why should the government know how I spend my money, And then soon you'll be banned to buy certain things, or like, especially also with an AI and adding AI to that and everything, your car, your self-driving car might take you straight to the police station if you've done something wrong, So
do you have more of an optimistic view or a pessimistic view on how all this plays out? Especially, I'm curious, in Europe, I feel like Europe's definitely a little further along on that trend, than the US. The US is kind of, we have 50-50 here in terms of people wanting more or less, and then you have places like Canada, Australia, which are a bit more extreme. So I'm curious how you see, are you optimistic about the future in Germany? Are you looking, for backup plans? A lot of Bitcoiners like collecting passports. They all want to move to El Salvador. I think some of them are a bit, pessimistic on the future, but I'm also young and naive to some degree.
Well, I'm always optimistic about the future, but the question is really whether is the EU going to ban proof of work? And then for me, it's actually time to pack up my things and move to another country, But until then, I'm totally optimistic about the future. And the only enemy for Bitcoin might be some regulations, but luckily all the countries will never agree on one thing, That's the only thing that could stop Bitcoin is actually world peace. And if it takes that to reduce my net worth, that we have world peace, then I'm willing to do that. Then it's fine, As long as we have then world peace, then it's fine for Bitcoin to go to zero. But I don't think that's ever going to happen. It never happened that the world agreed on one thing, that you have all the countries agreeing on the same thing. I think it's never going to happen. So you can just move out to other countries where they have different regulations, But right now, the regulations in Germany are pretty good, Like, you buy Bitcoin, you hold it for 1 year, and it's tax-free. So I can't complain, really,
Oh, wow. That's pretty nice, actually. That's kind of what I was going to ask you, was what the regulation was like over there compared to here. Because in my opinion, sometimes like Tristan was saying, it's sort of like a 50-50 over here on what could happen depending on like who's in power and all these various things, how people react to changes. I'm pretty optimistic over here. I feel like enough people, especially during 2020, like we mentioned earlier, have woken up here that at least because we have the state system, I feel like individually state-wise, in some states you'll be more okay than other states, but we'll see how it goes. I have to be cautiously optimistic because otherwise I'll just cry myself to sleep every night.
Yeah, I mean, especially I think in the States during COVID, I think things improved quite a lot. I mean, also the mayor of Miami getting paid in Bitcoin, then the mayor in New York getting paid some of his wages in Bitcoin. But I think it's through these scammers like Sam Bankman-Fried and all these guys, like that puts a bad image on Bitcoin, even though it's not even Bitcoin, it was rather crypto related, But the mainstream media, they don't differentiate between crypto and Bitcoin, So
well, that's the battle that anything like this is going to have to face, is sort of the bad actors that are within anything. I mean, and we could go on about, like, for instance, like the carnivore community, like any sort of community is going to have something that goes haywire, and then like the mainstream conventional side's always going to take that and make it marked as the whole thing is bad. It's just how it is.
Absolutely. I mean, Senator Warren, she's forming this anti-crypto, how's it called? Anti-crypto?
Yeah, task force. I don't even know. Something like that. Yeah.
Anti-crypto force. And I believe we already have an anti-crypto force, and they're called Bitcoin maximalists, so we don't need another one, so.
Yeah, that's how it goes. So, I mean, at the end of the day, she's incentivized to, get reelected, appeal to her constituents who clearly, are all in the realm of believing that they can make a difference in climate change. And, they're all vegans. They hate Bitcoin. It's all like the same type of person, when in reality that none of them actually understand the deeper functionality of any of these topics. Right. And that's my biggest pet peeve, is like, health, nutrition, Bitcoin, energy consumption, the grid. Like, these are all very technical topics. So I can't believe that we have journalists, writing about this stuff. They really have no idea what's going on. I mean, the article that just came out about, Riot, or just like the Texas grid and all that. And it's like, they don't even take ERCOT's perspective, and they just shit on Bitcoin mining, and they don't even understand the high level of how grid functionality occurs. But that's what it is, ignorance. And we can just sit here cozy knowing that we have a deeper understanding, and that we believe this is, the future. So, Moritz, want to be considerable of your time. I know it's a bit late. So we talked a lot about, some great things: athletics, training, diet, cold. From what I'm getting at, summarizing many of the most effective, training habits, health habits, are free, are low cost. Connecting with nature is invaluable. We preach that a lot. We love cold. Eating an animal-based diet is easy, it's simple, it's effective, high protein. Bitcoin is great, it's empowering, but do your own research, take a deeper dive. So at a high level, decentralization, how do you embody decentralization, or think about it as really improving the state of the world? And, what does it mean to you to truly be a decentralized person?
Well, I think that most of the people, when they talk about decentralization, it's exactly the opposite. So I think the term is really getting abused quite a lot. Yeah. So as soon as I think about decentralization, I actually think about Bitcoin, and especially about proof of work. But I think there's a few new systems where you can actually do call it decentralized, if you look at Nostr now, I think it's a great way to communicate. And I think it's a much, much better than communicating on Twitter. And it's like the first time that we have social media where you can call it that it is actually decentralized, So
yeah, I totally agree. And I think more of these things are going to pop up, but to me, it comes down at the individual level, right? I mean, it's like, you just got to take ownership. There's some things you can, win, and some things you can't win. Like before Nostr, there's not really decentralized social media. I mean, your phone, your computer, your car, you can't really buy these things from decentralized companies or small or local producers. It just doesn't exist. So you have to pick and choose your battles. And that's why we're big on food. Talk to your local rancher or farmer, because you can actually make an impact and support decentralization. You can't do that in all facets of life. But hopefully we see more progress in this space, coming. And I think we will.
For sure. I totally agree. And I think I also buy all my meat locally and visit my local butcher. I think you should support them, because these people, they hardly survive, So it's the big chains actually that destroy like all these single shops, So we should really support our local shops for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And, people need to get accustomed to paying a little more. And that's where we have this whole, exchange value for value with Bitcoin, and paying local producers in Bitcoin. That's really gets me fired up. So maybe you can orange pill some of those guys as well. And we'll be right on the right track for progress.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's no such thing as cheap meat. I mean, the only place where I ate really good cheap meat is in South Africa.
Okay. I've heard
The
South
meat is so
America
cheap.
as well, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, but that's because their economy is fucked. That's not because, it's worth less, really.
But in South Africa, the good meat is so cheap,
Yeah.
you feel actually sorry that they killed the animal for that kind of price, So
It's good to know. But all right, Moritz. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find more of you? Social media, website. Where can you be contacted, found?
well, you can mainly find me on Instagram and on Facebook, and I'm just setting up my Noster account, so I'll be active on that. I'm using Twitter as well, but it's really just for me to get information for myself. I'm not active. I'm only retweeting things. But mainly basically Instagram and soon on Noster as well.
Okay, and your Instagram is just Moritz Klatten?
You can find me in the Moritz Klatten.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect.
It's Champ Performance is the name of my business, but you can find me under Moritz Klatten.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode of Decentralized Radio. Have a good one.